Press.
Good morning. It is good to see you and have you with us again today as we continue our study of the Ten Commandments. And we're having a live service at the same time I'm recording this. And I have announced in the past that we probably will have at least two more sermons after this one on this 10th commandment. A lot is said about coveting. And I may divide those sermons up so I would just consider them two sermons because the subject matter will be a lot the same. But anyway, we do plan to continue studying this 10th commandment for a little bit before we leave our study of the 10 commandments. I want to give a very brief review. I don't want to spend much time on this, but I do want us to recall some things in our study so far of the 10 commandments. We saw in our first sermon, we've been talking about the 10 commandments, and you know, these 10 commandments are often divided into two categories: love God and love your neighbor. The first four really have to do with our relationship with God almost exclusively, and then our last six have to do with loving our neighbor. But of course, they also include our relationship with God, but how that is governed by our relationship with others. But I wanted you to think about the 10 commandments in another way as well. The first four that talk about our love for God have an upward focus. And we see that clearly. And in the next five, we see that they have, you might say, an outward focus. And then when we come to the 10th commandment, do not covet, we can see that this very clearly has an inward focus. Now, I don't want to make too much of this, but we do see this with the 10th commandment like we don't see with the other nine. It's very clear that the focus is on the heart. Coveting is a matter of the heart. It's the desires of the heart. Now, all of the other nine had to do with our heart as well. We've seen that as we studied the other nine commandments, but this one is very explicit, and I just wanted to point that out. And then we studied in our first sermon on the 10th commandment why it's so important. It exposes our heart, the inner person, and it teaches us how the other commandments are to be interpreted. Now, we saw that with all the other nine commandments, that elsewhere, when they're expanded upon, we see that they apply to the heart as well. They have to do with our heart. And then we saw that this commandment has a very convicting power. I just mentioned it, but this is what I plan to do in a couple of sermons down the line. I plan to show you how that this commandment is what really convicted Paul. It really grabbed him. And so I want to talk about what he says about this 10th commandment and the effect that it had upon his heart. And then it touches on the real problem of society. The reason people sin and cause wars or whatever is because of the heart. All right. And so in our first sermon, we talked about the basic meaning of covet. It means to desire. We saw that we looked at some things that are right there on the surface. Wrong desire is itself sin. We saw the problem is the human heart. And we saw the state of our hearts is really the true measure of our character. And so I don't want to talk about them much. If you want to the notes, or you want to hear those sermons again, you can hear them. But that's pretty important. Those are three pretty important things that we need to understand about coveting. Just having a wrong desire itself is sin. That's real important to know right there. And it's all a matter of the heart. And that's what really determines our true character. Three very important things. So today, we want to continue this teaching that Jesus gives us here in Luke chapter 12. And we basically have talked about verses 13 through 21. But in our first sermon, what we did is we looked at the context. We went back to the first 12 verses of chapter 12, and we looked at what Jesus is teaching. And one of the things we saw in verses 1 through 3, he's teaching about religious hypocrisy. we see that before this large crowd, he's teaching about, the danger of fearing people, and they can only kill the body instead of fearing God like we should. And he taught about being confident, having trust and confidence in God's providential care. That's very important. That's a great sermon. All these are great sermons in and of themselves. And he taught about the importance of confessing Christ before people, not being ashamed of Christ. These are extremely important subjects that Jesus was teaching on when we looked at the context to the passage that we want to look at more closely today. But we come to the context there. That's part of the context. We come to our passage beginning with verse 13. And here's this guy, after listening to Jesus talk about these very important subjects, he interrupts Jesus. And from the crowd, he says, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the inheritance." And so we talked about we talked about the importance of listening. Jesus said, "Consider carefully how you listen." Those are all very important words in that sentence, aren't they? You think about this. That's what the word consider means. It can be translated think. Think about this. Think about it carefully. How you listen. Well, this man's mind that's not what Jesus was teaching about. This man's mind obviously was on his inheritance and the problems he was having with his brother. And Jesus pointed out, really rebuked him. That's not why I came to this earth. There are judges. God has appointed judges and lawyers and so forth to work out these things, political leaders. And he didn't come to do that primarily. And then Jesus uses this man's interruption to teach another sermon. He gave us a parable. We call it the parable of the rich fool. And he said, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. And so we want to now, that's the context. Very quickly, that's what I preached in another sermon in more detail, but that's the context. I just want to remind you. Now we want to get to the content of what Jesus taught in this parable. What moved Jesus to tell this parable? Well, according to the passage again, there were many people around him and they were listening to Jesus. There were so many people around him. God's word actually says they were pressing in around him. They were crowding. When you get a real large audience and there's not seats for people to sit in, they keep bunching up. Like think of a concert or something. People start pressing, and you get more and more people pressed in toward Jesus. That's what was going on this occasion. And as we said, Jesus was teaching on these extremely important subjects. And we talked about them, the danger of hypocrisy, the danger of fearing people and not fearing God, being the importance of trusting in God and so forth, and not being afraid of people, not being ashamed to admit that we're believers as well. Those are some of the things that Jesus was teaching on. But so Jesus starts off by telling us about this man's situation. He said that this man was a certain rich man, yielded an abundant harvest. And so this is the content here. Now, is there anything wrong with that? Is there anything wrong with the fact that this farmer was very successful, that he was rich, that he had a bumper crop? Was there anything wrong with that? Well, no. The Bible never teaches that it's a sin to be rich. It never teaches that it's wrong to be successful in our work. The Bible never teaches that. And before I go on, I want to say something to define rich. If you own, a few shirts and you own some coats and hats, and I own probably 3 or 4 or 5 pairs of shoes. I have several pairs of socks, underclothes. I have shirts. We live in a house where we have electricity. We have two vehicles. My wife and I have two vehicles. We have running water. We have, as I said, electricity, and we live in a country that has paved roads and conveniences everywhere. We can eat, and we don't usually go hungry, you see, from eating. And if you're like that, you're rich compared to the rest of the world right now. You might think, well, I'm not very rich. Well, you're looking at things from an American, you might say, point of view. And you're thinking, well, I compare myself to people around me, and they make more money than I do. But I'm telling you, if you have a car, most people in the world don't have a car. If you have shoes, it may be that most people in the world don't even have any shoes. Most people in the world don't have underclothes underneath their clothes. They're going without they don't have running water in their house. And so I want to first of all try to tell you that if you're like me, and if you're like, and most of you probably listening to this are like me, you're rich. And so don't look around at someone who makes, millions, has millions of dollars or whatever, and you think they're rich and I'm not. No, you're rich. And so when we preach about money, just remember, if you're like this, you've got several pairs of clothes and shoes and all of these things, and you have a vehicle and running water and electricity. We're talking about you when we talk about rich people, because we're rich compared to most of this world. So is there anything wrong with being rich? No, there's nothing wrong in and of itself with being rich. So what was his problem? Was it because he gained this prosperity by dishonest means? Well, there's no indication of that in the text. We don't have any reason to believe that this man became very prosperous because he was dishonest. We're told that his harvest was an abundant harvest. Well, the implication is that God had blessed the labors of his hands, his crops. God caused that soil to be fertile. God sent sufficient rains. God allowed him to keep those crops from being destroyed by wild animals. In most parts of the world, we don't think about it as much here. Farmers having to worry about their crops being destroyed by wild animals. But in most parts of the world, this is one of their problems as well. But God kept that from happening to this man so that he had an abundant harvest. And so it was God's blessing that this man's farming endeavors were so successful. Farmers aren't supposed to labor, or anybody's not supposed to labor at their job hoping that they have a bad harvest. That's not more spiritual, to hope that your business doesn't succeed. If a farmer has great crops and he becomes very prosperous, that's not bad in and of itself. But here, Jesus gets inside this man's heart. Remember, we said coveting is a matter of the heart. And he tells us what this person is thinking about his prosperity. And so he had a prosperous situation. He tells us, though, when he gets into this part, he tells us what he was thinking. What was his concern? He said, he thought to himself, what shall I do? I have no place to store my crops. So here he is, he's got this bumper crop. He's concerned about what he's going to do with all this extra money that he's got. My barns aren't big enough for all this surplus. What am I going to do with all this surplus? Well, that's a good question. It's a very reasonable question. It's the right question to ask. I've been blessed with an abundance. What am I going to do with it? Very good question. And so now we see his confident plan. He said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store my surplus grain. I'll expand my storage facilities. I'll stockpile. I'll put more money in savings. I'll buy a bigger house. I'll hoard up all this extra wealth I have. That's what he said. And this was his pleasant expectation from all that. He said in verse 19, I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain stored up for many years. Take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry. And so that's his expectation, wasn't it? This is what he's thinking. I've worked hard. I've been prosperous. I have more than my barns can hold. This is what I'm going to do with this extra money. I'll build bigger barns. I'll put more money in savings for retirement. I will build a bigger house. I'll buy a nicer car. I'll arrange my income so I can retire earlier and play golf and go fishing and go on vacations, or do nothing if I want to. I'll spend my winter in Florida and Arizona, and I'll spend my summers in the mountains. I'll live a life of ease. And the faster I make money, the faster I'll be able to do this. And if I can, I'll leave a huge inheritance for my children so that they can have generational wealth. You see, that's the American dream. He could see it all, the good life. I've finally made it. I have no worries. I have it all. What a happy life I'm going to live, just eating and drinking and being merry all my days. And then we have next in Jesus' parable, the rude awakening. But God, anytime you see that, in fact, several decades ago, I was made aware of anytime you read but God in the Bible, I used to underline every time I saw but God, because that's where you really better perk up and pay attention. But God. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? You see, this poor man, he seemed to think that he was in control of his future. He forgot about having to stand before God after death, and therefore he was a fool. That's what the Bible calls a fool. That very night that he was having pleasant dreams, he laid his head down on his nice soft bed and his nice soft pillow with a smile on his face, just thinking about a life of ease and comfort. But on that night, his soul was required of him. And all that he had worked for was left behind for his children and the heirs to fight over, just like that man that caused Jesus to give this parable in Luke chapter 12. And he lifted up his eyes in hell, just like another man that Luke is going to talk about in his gospel. And so we've seen the background to this, the context of this parable, haven't we? We've seen that's what Jesus was talking about, and this just interrupts him. And so that's the context of the parable. And now we've seen the content. This is the content that we've read. We've read through the content of the parable right now. And so now what I want to do is I want to spend the rest of the time looking at the application of this parable. Jesus said, this is his own exposition of what he's just told us in this parable. He said, this is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich out toward God. This is the person whose heart is preoccupied with acquiring more and more and more and enjoying constantly the things of this world, but neglects to be rich in the things of God, rich toward God, rich in faith, rich in good works, rich in fruits of righteousness. In the language of Paul, in 1 Timothy chapter 6 and verse 19, Paul says, laying up treasure for themselves as a firm foundation for the coming age, so that they might take hold of the life that is truly life. A lot of people aren't thinking so much about laying up treasure in that way. But a person who fails to do this, who fails to seek God first in all their wealth, God's kingdom, his righteousness first, but instead gives his chief attention and his best energies to pursuing possessions and pleasures of this world, that person, Jesus says, is a fool. So this is the charge from the Son of God himself. Those who feel and behave like this man in this parable, he says, are fools. Now, this is the application part of this sermon and this parable. And as I seek to apply this parable to us, I want to ask you, I want to do it by asking this question. Where exactly did this man go wrong? What did his failure consist of? Well, it wasn't some things. It wasn't that he was successful. We've already said that. There's nothing wrong with being successful in and of itself. It wasn't that he cheated or gained his possessions dishonestly. There's no indication that happened. So what did his failure consist of? Where did this man go wrong? That's where I want to spend the remainder of our sermon today. First of all, he failed to realize his dependence upon God and his accountability to God for all that he had. Now, if you didn't notice, I underlined and bolded the word all, for all that he had. Did you notice that in all his plans and thoughts, he never mentions God? He speaks of my crops, my goods. Jesus describes him as laying up treasure for himself. And in all of his thoughts, he never prays. He never asked God what he should do with his abundance. No, he thought he was at perfect liberty to do with his prosperity as he pleased. I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build greater. I will store my crops and my goods, and I will say to my soul, and so on. Then Jesus said that he said to himself. There's no thought of his dependence upon God or his accountability to God for everything that he had. And we must ask this obvious question. Now, this is Jesus teaching this, but we've got to ask this. It's just obvious. What about you and me? Do you realize your absolute dependence upon God for all that you have? It is God who gives you the ability to work. It is God who allows you to be born, many of us, in the United States. If you're successful at anything you do, at going anywhere you live, God has allowed you to be successful as you have been. Listen to a couple of passages. James 1, verse 17. Every good and every perfect gift is from above and comes down from the Father of lights. I don't know if you notice that word every. I tried to, again, bold it and underline it. You shouldn't miss it. Every. It all comes down from God. This is a passage that is really important, this next one. Listen to this. And what do you have that you did not receive? That's a good question. Well, if you look at James, everything came from God. That's the answer to that question. And if you did receive it, and of course you did, why do you boast as though you didn't receive it? I'll tell you what, I memorized this passage several years ago because this is very important. Paul is pointing out that nobody on this earth has room for boasting about anything. Everything you have has been given to you. There is no room for you to be proud in and of yourself. In other words, this debunks the American idea that, you're a self-made man or woman. In other words, there is no such thing as a self-made man or woman, because you're not a self-made man or woman. All that you have comes from God as a gift, all. But not only did this man fail to realize his absolute dependence upon God for everything he had, but he failed to realize his accountability to God for his wealth. We must understand our property, our money, our possessions, all that we have does not belong to us. All of it doesn't belong to us. Ultimately, all of it belongs to God. God tells us our relationship to things that we have is that of a manager or a steward. Now, a steward is a person who manages property or money that belongs to someone else. And that's the way we have to look at what God has given us. We're managers, we're stewards. And when you are a steward, you know what they're going to do? They're going to send an accountant, someone to come in and audit what you have done, how you manage someone else's money. And that's going to happen to us as well. You see, basically, God put into this man's care. This is all being put into his care like a steward by the real owner. And he's accountable to the real owner for every single bit of it. Not, if he gives to the church, but the rest of it's mine. No, all of it. And that's the same way it is with our relationship to God. Whether we have little or much, and this includes our time and all of our possessions, but God has given it to us. And ultimately, every single thing that we have belongs to God. We're just stewards. We are just managing what God, all the money we have, all the property we have, all of our possessions, they are literally God's money, God's property, God's possessions. We're managers who are accountable to Him for everything that we have and what we do with it. And that includes what we do with any part of it. Not just 10%. A lot of people, I've always believed in giving 10% or more, but I've also thought many times, well, the rest of it's mine. No, it's not. It's not just whatever we give to the church that belongs to the church, but the rest of it's mine, or whatever portion it is. I'm told that most people don't give 10%. According to people who study, people who go to church, they might give 1, 2, or 3%, if that much. But they think, well, the rest of it's mine. No, it all belongs to God, all of it. As a result, when you think of it like that, we must never use our money or our possessions thoughtlessly and carelessly. We must recognize that at all times, everything we have has been entrusted into our hands by God, and we must use it prayerfully and carefully and under the guidance of biblical principles and biblical priorities, not our own personal priorities. And so this man failed to consider these things. He failed to realize his dependence upon God, his accountability to God for all that he had, that he was going to stand before God and have to give an account of all of this that he had been given into his hands by God. So that's the first problem of where he went wrong. He failed to realize that. Secondly, he never considered the needs of others. He seems to think that, have no idea that there's any other way of using his abundance, his discretionary income or whatever, except to store it up, use it for himself, retire early. He said to himself, what shall I do? I don't have any more room to store up my crops. There's an early church father by the name of Ambrose, and in speaking on this passage, he replies to what this rich man was thinking to himself, and he said, you have barns, the bosoms of the needy, the houses of widows, the orphans and infants. But you see, that never crossed this man's mind. The more he makes, the more he thinks about how he can spend all that upon himself, all that he can do with that money and all the ways that he can enjoy it. Now, it's good, of course, and biblical to provide for our families and also to lay up wisely for the future. There's no doubt about that. But beyond that, our priority must be the needs of our brothers and sisters in Christ and the advancement of the gospel. God underlines this in many places, that generosity is one of the characteristics of a believer. It's one of the evidences of true and saving religion. You remember what James says in James chapter 2, verse 14. What good is it, brothers and sisters, if someone claims to have faith but has no deeds? Can such faith save them? And then he goes on to explain Suppose a brother or sister is without clothes and daily food. If one of you says to them, go in peace, keep warm and well fed, but does nothing about their physical needs, what good is that? In the same way, faith by itself is not accomplished by, if not accomplished by action, is dead. So, and what works does he specifically have in mind here? Well, in this context, works of mercy, works of generosity toward those who are in need. Those of us who've experienced God's saving mercy, we ought to be merciful people. We ought to be generous people, both in terms of our the physical needs of others, but also their spiritual needs, giving generously to the cause of the good news about Christ. God's been merciful to us. He's been gracious to us. We should be conduits of that, not reservoirs of all that he gives to us. We're just conduits. We pass those blessings that we've been given to others. He's been good to us. We show that in others. And that's what he's talking about in Matthew 25 when he talks about this is what saved people are like. And then thirdly, he seemed to think that it was only right that his standard of living should be at the same level as his income. Isn't this his assumption? That his standard of living ought to be the same level of his income. In other words, if you make $200,000 a year, that means you ought to live a $200,000 a year lifestyle. That was the man's mindset. My fields have brought forth in abundance. So what should I do? Well, it just seemed normal for this man. It seemed natural to him that he should build bigger barns, have more money in savings, so he can retire earlier in his retirement plan, that he could enjoy all that crop and all that abundance for a longer amount of time. He could eat, drink, and be merry. But it never occurred to him that just because he had the ability and he had the available income to buy a second home in Florida or to purchase that state-of-the-art fishing boat or to buy a more expensive car or a better and more elaborate house and vacation, go on, bigger and better vacations, that didn't mean necessarily that he should do that. You see, a lot of people say, well, if I make more, just spend more on myself or save more for myself, ultimately. But just because you make more doesn't mean that that's how you should spend your money. Now, again, let me be very clear. Working hard and making a lot of money because God gives you the opportunity to do so, and you're diligent as a believer, that's not the same thing as being greedy. Not, for example, if you give a lot of it away for the cause of Christ. That's not greedy. That's not covetousness. If I'm a conduit of God's blessings rather than a cul-de-sac, you might say. Working to increase my income beyond what I need, that's not the same thing as laying up treasures on earth. If I'm working to increase my income, mainly so I can give more to the cause of Christ. If I make $200,000 a year, it doesn't mean that I have to live a $200,000 a year lifestyle. I might live very comfortably on a $150,000 lifestyle, or a $100,000 lifestyle, or even a $75,000 lifestyle, and give the rest of it away to promoting the cause of Christ. And perhaps depending on, what part of the world we live in, the cost of living and so on, and how big our family is, we could still live fine, meet all of our needs, and the rest could be invested in the kingdom, or the way that God thinks that we ought to use this abundant wealth that he has given to us. I'll never forget my father telling me decades ago. I was a young man. I think I was single, so that'd be a long time ago, but I'll never forget, he told me, this was back when $2,000 a month was a really comfortable income for upper middle class, maybe more. But he said if a person made $2,000 a month and all of a sudden their income increased to $5,000 a month, he said, well, what people do is they just adjust their standard of living to live on $5,000 a month. And I remember that for decades, and I've just watched it happen time and time again, and spot on. The more people make, they just raise their standard of living to that level. And so, and I want you to remember, just because God blesses you materially doesn't mean that God is happy with you. If you read Romans chapter 1, God turns people over to their sinful desires. And sometimes it's sexual desires, sometimes it's monetary and other, because God is angry. That's out of his wrath. And you remember Job's friends thought, if you're blessed a lot, God loves you. If you're not being blessed, God's not as happy with you. And that was a false mindset. And so, as we talked about, Matthew 25 referred to it. This is the way that people will be known who are entering the kingdom. They're people who cared for the poor. They cared for the needs of others. So, I remember reading in, I forget, it's Rick something in his book, Purpose Living Driven Life. But anyway, he says that they've got some people who are kingdom builders in his churches. He said they've made all the money they need to make in life. They're living extremely comfortable. And instead of retiring early, they're continuing to work and giving 100% of that money, anything they make. At that point on in their life, they're giving it all to the cause of Christ. But how few people ever think this way? I've never met someone that thinks exactly like that I know of. That just because I make more, you see, it doesn't mean I have to adjust my standard of living to that lifestyle, or saving more for retirement so I can retire early. Am I being unfair when I say that most professing believers have basically the same mindset of this man that Jesus calls a fool? And remember, if you're in America, you're like me, you're rich. The more and more I make, the more and more I can spend on luxuries for myself. Or that so-called disposable income can all be disposed on myself. Or that some people, no matter how much they make, they never have enough because they spend right up to the limit and more. And they always keep themselves in, you might say, debt, no matter how much they make. Or I'll put more and more away because I really like seeing those numbers grow all the time in my savings or retirement account. But is that the way that God wants us to live? I understand that's the so-called American way of life. I know that's the American mentality. But what I'm asking is, how does God want us to live with our wealth? You see, we're very influenced. Every society is influenced. They influence their people. But let's just call it in America for what it is. It's self-centeredness, and it's selfishness, and it's greed, and it's covetousness. And this is what God is condemning as a sin in the Ten Commandments, especially when much of our income isn't even needed. And there's strategic causes for Christ and endeavors that never get off the ground because they lack financial support. I've heard that at least 3 billion people in today's world have never heard anything about Jesus. And they've never had any witness at all in their culture about Jesus at all. And if we are ever to get the good news to them, that means that we've got to find people who are willing to go. And then we've got to have people who are willing to support those people, because they can't, many times make that money on their own. They're going to have expenses to get over there and do the work. And all the wealth that is needed is already in the churches in America. If God's people, or claim to profess to be God's people, would be content to live godly lives of simplicity and to give what they don't really need for the cause of Christ, instead of building up bigger and bigger and bigger barns. Now, I know that what I'm saying is extremely challenging. Actually, all of the Ten Commandments are, aren't they? It's challenging to me too. I understand that. And I think a lot of people look around at Americans who are a lot richer than you know, me, and they think, well, those are the rich people, and I'm poor. But like I said, if you own more than one pair of shoes, and like I do, and you own underclothes and shirts and coats and sweaters like I do, and have running water and electricity like I do, and have a vehicle like I do, you're rich. And you know, you could always live on less than you do. A lot of people are, even here in the United States. We are extremely wealthy Americans, and we are going to stand before God someday, just like this man. We're going to give an account of what we've done with this tremendous money that he gave us. A lot of people have kind of reduced, you know, life to you go to church and you do church right. Well, you're going to be judged on more than just going to church and make sure you're doing it the right way. And so surely none of us, I think I've tried to show this on the other 9 commandments too. None of us can say we're guiltless on any of these 10 commandments. And we're not guiltless when it comes to the 10th commandment. And we are going to stand before God someday on the way that we have used his money. And this takes us right back to the gospel. The reason that I know I'm saved today, and I'm not going to be condemned for the sins that I've committed when it comes to my possessions, is because Christ has paid the penalty for all of my sins. And on top of that, his righteousness has been credited to my account, because my righteousness isn't perfect. And I don't want to be judged by the things that I've done. I want to be judged on the basis of what Christ has done for me, and I will be. That's where I'm putting my trust. And for people who are putting their trust in their own life, they're going to be judged for all these things. It'll be on them. God's going to punish every sin. It's either going to be punished in you, or it's going to be punished in Christ on the cross. And mine are going to be punished through Christ. But if you think you've lived a pretty decent life, and a lot of rich people who give more generously to the church think, well, you know, they get a lot of praise for that, and they think, well, I'm giving very liberally to the church compared to anyone else. Well, you might could have given a ton more, and you didn't. So I wouldn't rest on that. God gave you more, and you didn't have to spend as much as you spent on yourself. So we have to admit what I'm saying here. This is the truth, what God is teaching here. We all have to ask this question: has the attitude that I've learned about money and possessions come from God's word or from contemporary American culture for most of us? And I know you can go here and there and pick out, you know, scriptures to justify yourself for making money and saving money and preparing for retirement. I understand all that, but there's a lot more to it than that. We don't need to spend as much as we do on what we do. It's an attitude that we must cultivate an attitude that everything we have belongs to him. And all of this. So we need a heart transplant, don't we? And it's only when we put our trust in God alone to save us that he gives us a new heart. And so you can talk about you want to do, what you should not do, all you want to, but that's just an outward appearing to be righteous if the heart isn't changed on the inside. There's a Russian author. When I lived in Russia, very frequently I was asked about Russian authors and very, very often about Leo Tolstoy. He was a very famous Russian author, but I haven't read his works, and they were disappointed that I hadn't read a lot of Russian works and novelists. But he did write about one time a successful peasant farmer who wasn't satisfied with his lot. He was about like this guy. He said, more of everything, this peasant farmer. So one day he received a novel offer. For 400 rubles, he could buy all the land. He could have all the land that he could walk around in a single day. The only catch was that he had to be back at the starting place by sundown. So early the next morning, this peasant farmer started walking as fast as he could. By midday, Tolstoy says he was very tired, and he realized at that point that his greed had taken him far away from the starting point. So he began to pick up his pace even as tired as he was. The sun began to sink low, he said, in the sky, and he began to run, knowing that if he didn't get back by sundown, the opportunity to be a much larger landowner would be lost. And as the sun began to set below the sky, he came within sight of the finish line. He says, gasping for breath, with his heart pounding, he called upon every bit of energy left in his body, and he staggered across the finish line just before the sun set. And immediately he collapsed, blood was streaming from his mouth, and in a few minutes he was dead. Afterwards, Tolstoy says, his servants dug a grave for his body. The grave was about 6 feet long and about 3 feet wide. And the title to Tolstoy's story is, How Much Land Does a Man Need? Well, let me ask you, how much land does a man need? How many possessions does a person need? How much do we really need? How much can I give away, realizing that I'm the manager of the Lord's possessions and that I'm put on this earth to be a conduit to ensure that his causes are advanced? And then fourthly, this man in the parable was expecting from material things what material things can never give. He thought his abundance would bring contentment. He thought his abundance would bring happiness to his soul. He says, I say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. That was his hope. That was his expectation. A lot of money, a lot of happiness. A lot of money, a lot of enjoyment. But he was expecting from material things what they can't give. Now, the body can find some comfort in these things, but you can't even count on that. Riches don't keep away sickness from a lot of people. Just look around. Rich people get sick too. And they don't keep you from bad health, from you or your family, do they necessarily? They don't keep away sorrow. Riches don't keep away sorrow from rich people. They don't keep away pain and disappointment. But this is especially true when it comes to the soul. The soul needs something that's much better than this. The soul needs something that's much more substantial, much more long-lasting than just temporal pleasures in this life. We can pamper our body all we want to while the soul is starving. You know, the Israelites when they left Egypt, they complained out in the wilderness for a lack of meat. They didn't like what their food was. They were eating. God was sustaining, taking care of them, but they didn't like that lack of meat. And so they complained about that, and God gave them what they requested. And Psalm 106 says, and he sent leanness into their soul. Jesus said, we will not live by bread alone. I think we see a lot of leanness in the souls of attending the services, Christians, professing Christians. They're getting what they want. They get riches. God gives them that opportunity and gives it all to them. But there's a lot of leanness in their souls. The temporary possessions of this world can never satisfy the thirst and hunger of our soul. You see, they are no more filling to the soul than the husk that prodigal son ate when he was in the pig pen. They can't satisfy. Riches can't satisfy the soul. This is what Jesus meant when he said a person is a fool when he lays up treasures for himself, but he's not rich toward God. True riches, riches of the kind that bring happiness and satisfaction and security, that healthcare programs and education in the United Nations and other things can't bring. Those are the things that make a person rich toward God. You see, true riches. And who is rich toward God? Who is that person? Well, he's a person who has a good conscience, whose conscience has been cleansed from guilt by the blood of Christ. You know, a lot of people go around with a guilty conscience for things they've done in the past. You know why? Because it's never been cleansed. You know, we're rich toward God when our conscience has been cleansed. That man is rich. He has true riches. A man is rich when he's been reconciled to God by the death of his son, when he has been saved from hell, when he has been secured for heaven. William Taylor was a very famous missionary, and William Taylor said one time, God for us in the work of his son, God with us in the ordering of his providence, God in us by the indwelling of the Holy Spirit, God before us in the hope of heaven. Earthly pleasures, earthly possessions can never ease the soul. They can never make a heart truly merry with any kind of true eternal happiness. Only God can do that. And that's why you see people who are really happy in this world, and they may not have a lot of possessions. They may not be healthy physically or whatever, but they are happy. Don't be fooled by the advertisements on television. They bombard you by telling you that you deserve this. Well, you don't deserve anything. But don't let those false promises lead you astray. They can never give you what God can give you. Only God can give you. And this is a very, very famous saying of Augustine. He said, God made us for himself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in him. That's an extremely famous quote, by the way. And it's true. Only God can give this. And then finally, my last point is this. He thought he had plenty of time. He said, I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain for many years, laid up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, and be merry. He thought he had many years to enjoy all those worldly comforts and all these things that he had worked to acquire. And he went to bed dreaming these sweet dreams. What pleasures lie ahead for himself. But the decree went out that night, and the grim reaper went out to usher his soul into the presence of God, and he couldn't take any of those riches with him. Just himself, naked, not clothed with the righteousness of God, standing before an infinite and just God to give an account of how he had used his wealth, among other things. Two men were overheard one time discussing the death of a man that had just been announced in the newspaper, and one of them asked, how much did he leave? And the other one said, all that he had. Whether you are rich or poor, when we die, we will leave behind all that we had that God gave us to manage. We can't take any of it with us. And then what's going to matter is your relationship with God. What did you do that counted for eternity? And all that you did that counts for eternity has been done for you in Jesus Christ. And your death, I believe, will come sooner than you think. I've read Solomon's works in Ecclesiastes, Proverbs for many years. And one of the things that made Solomon a wise man was that he paid attention. So I thought, and this is decades ago, he just looked around and watched things. Well, I've been trying to do the same thing Solomon did. He said that's what made him wise. Well, I've been watching. And I'm a minister. And in my experience of watching people who have died over the years, most of them didn't think they'd die as soon as they thought. Almost all of them. There's a couple of exceptions. I've been in the room with people who knew they were told, hey, you're going to die today or tomorrow or whatever, and they knew it. I've been in the room with some people like that, and they knew it was coming. But most people thought, I don't care if they had cancer or whatever, they still thought, I still might live longer. Something might happen. Almost everybody thought they'd live longer than they thought, not than they actually did. But Jesus said sometimes this day, he told that man, your soul will be required of you. And it won't matter how much money you have when you die. You don't, it doesn't matter what your plans are, what your ambitions are. You don't have a guarantee for to live a single other day. You don't have a guarantee that you will live through today. You don't. There's many people I know that die suddenly. It shocks us. It seems like when it happens, most of us are shocked. Well, but it can come for any of us at any time. I was talking to a lady just half a week ago, and she said, yeah, my father died. And I said, really? I'm so sorry to hear that. She said, well, it's okay. She's this way. She told me. She said, he had an aneurysm. He went to bed that night and had an aneurysm, just died suddenly. And I've known several people that die that way, or have a heart attack and die suddenly. And I want to tell you something, or a car accident, they get in the car, they don't plan to have a car accident and die that day. And when death finds you, nothing is going to matter except whether you were rich toward God. Have you put your confidence in him alone for your salvation? Do you look to him to save you because of what you've done or because of what he's done? And so someday I want to talk about the seventh commandment from Romans chapter, the 10th commandment from Romans chapter 7, where Paul says, it's this commandment right that slew him. That's what really got his attention when this one was applied to his soul. And I think we're beginning to see this. So I close by repeating what served as an introduction to our Lord's parable. Jesus says in the last verse, the application of this parable, he says, watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life does not consist in an abundance of possessions. May God bless us with a watchfulness that is a guard, as he says, against all kinds of greed, and fully understand. May we all fully understand our life does not consist in the abundance of our possessions.